Today dealing with the neurovascular vasculature of the infratemporal fossa. The main artery is the maxillary artery. It is the larger of the two terminal branches of the external carotid artery. It arises posterior to the neck of the mandible, and it is divided into three parts based on its relation to the lateral pterygoid muscle. The first one is the mandibular part, deep to the condyle of the mandible. The second part is the pterygoid part, neighbor to the lateral pterygoid muscle. The third part is the pterygopalatine part, inside the infratemporal fossa. The pterygopalatine fossa is a small space behind and below the orbital cavity. It has an inverted teardrops shaped space between the bones on the lateral side of the skull, immediately posterior to the maxilla. Although it is small in size, the pterygopalatine fossa communicates via fissures and foramina in its wall with the middle-cranial fossa, infratemporal fossa, floor of the orbit, lateral wall of the nasal cavity, oropharynx, and roof of the oral cavity. Also, with foramina and fissures provide a aperture through which structures enter and leave the pterygopalatine fossa. We have the foramen rotundum and pterygoid canal, middle cranial fossa, pterygo or palatovaginal canal, nasopharynx, palatine canal leads to the oral cavity, the hard palate, sphenopalatine foramen, nasal cavity, pterygomaxillary fissure, infratemporal fossa, inferior orbital fissure with the orbit. So like this, we have the tear, inverted tear-like shape, and look how much communications it has. It has many communications. Because of the strategic location, the pterygopalatine fossa is a major site of distribution of the maxillary nerve and for the terminal part of the maxillary artery, plus the parasympathetic fibers from the facial nerve, sympathetic fibers from T1 spinal cord level, joining the branch of the maxillary nerve in the pterygopalatine fossa. All the upper teeth receive their innervation and blood supply from the maxillary nerve and the terminal part of the maxillary artery, respectively, that pass through the pterygopalatine fossa. The skeletal framework, the walls of the pterygopalatine fossa are formed by parts of the palatine, maxillary, and sphenoidal bone. The anterior wall is formed by the posterior surface of the maxilla. The medial wall is formed by the lateral surface of the palatine bone. The posterior wall and roof are formed by parts of the sphenoid bone. And this is a picture of this pterygopalatine fossa. The part of the sphenoid bone that contribute to the formation of the pterygopalatine fossa is the anterior superior surface of the pterygoid process. Opening into the surface are two large foramina, maxillary nerve through the foramen rotundum, passing into the middle cranial fossa, greater petrosal nerve from the facial nerve, plus the sympathetic nerves of the internal carotid plexus, join to form the nerve of the pterygoid canal that pass in the pterygopalatine fossa through the anterior opening of the pterygoid canal. The pterygoid canal is a bony canal opening onto the posterior surface of the pterygoid process. The pterygoid canal opens into the middle cranial fossa, just anterior-inferior to the internal carotid artery, as the vessel enters the cranial cavity through the carotid canal. The contents of the pterygopalatine fossa, the third part, pterygopalatine part of the maxillary artery, plus maxillary nerve, plus nerve to pterygoid canal, that is, we call it medial nerve, and pterygopalatine ganglion. The maxillary nerve, it is purely sensory, originate from the trigeminal ganglion in the cranial cavity. it excites the middle cranial fossa and enters the pterygopalatine fossa through the foramen rotundum. Excite as the infraorbital nerve through the inferior orbital fissure. It gives sensory fibers. This is a picture. The branch within the fossal maxillary nerve is attached to the pterygopalatine ganglion by two ganglionic branch sensory fibers from the nose, palate, and pharynx, post-ganglionic parasympathetic fibers to the lacrimal gland. More anteriorly, posterior superior alveolar nerves are given off, pass through the pterygopalatine maxillary fissure into the infratemporal fossa. Here they divide into numerous small branches, enter the maxilla through the posterior alveolar foramen, supply the upper molar teeth, the mucous membrane of the buccal surface of the associated alveolar process, and the lining of the maxillary sinus. Anesthesia of the upper molar teeth and associated buccal mucosa can be achieved by a posterior superior alveolar block. As the maxillary nerve is about to enter the inferior orbital fissure, it gives rise to the zygomatic nerve, divide into zygomatic temporal branch, passing into the temporal fossa to supply the skin of the temple, zygomaticofacial nerve supplying the skin over the prominence of the cheek. And this is distribution of the maxillary nerve. The pterygopalatine ganglia, that is ganglionic pterygopalatine Michel's ganglion, sometimes called, or nasal ganglion, sphenopalatine ganglion, all is the name of this pterygopalatine ganglion, largest of the four parasympathetic ganglion in the head, formed by the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons associated with the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers of the facial nerve, carried by greater petrosal nerve and the nerve of the pterygoid canal. The postganglionic fibers, together with the sympathetic fibers, join to form the ganglionic branch of the maxillary nerve. Postsynaptic fibers arising from pterygopalatine ganglion supply the lacrimal gland as well as the nasal glands and minor salivary glands within the oral cavity. The postsynaptic fibers innervating the lacrimal gland pass to the lacrimal nerve to reach the lacrimal gland. What are the branches? The branches are the orbital branch, enter the orbit through the inferior orbital fissure, supply the orbital wall and the sphenoidal and ethmoidal sinuses. Greater and lesser palatine nerve supply the palate, tonsil, and nasal cavity. The greater palatine nerve originates from geniculate ganglion of the facial nerve in the temporal bone. In the palatine canal gives origin to the posterior inferior nasal nerves, which contribute to innervation of the lateral nasal wall. Greater petrosal nerve enters the pterygoid canal and becomes the nerve of pterygoid canal. The pharyngeal branch also supplies the roof of the nasopharynx. And this is the branchette of the branch of the maxillary nerve. The maxillary artery. It is a major branch of external carotid artery in the neck. It passes through the infratemporal fossa, enters the pterygopalatine fossa through pterygomaxillary fissure. A branch of the first part. We have deep auricular to external aquatic meatus, anterior tympanic artery to the tympanic membrane, middle meningeal to dura mater and calvaria, accessory meningeal artery to the cranial cavity, inferior alveolar artery to the mandibular gingiva and the teeth. Branch of the second part, we have the deep temporal artery to the temporal muscle, pterygoid artery to the pterygoid muscle, masseteric artery to the masseter artery, buccal artery to the buccinator muscle. Branch of the third part of the maxillary artery, we have the posterior superior alveolar artery and infraorbital artery, greater palatine artery, pharyngeal artery, sphenopalatine artery, artery of the pterygoid canal. Collectively, these branches supply the much of the nasal cavity and the roof of the oral cavity and all upper teeth. In addition, they contribute to the blood supply of the sinuses, oropharynx, and the floor of the aorta. The maxillary artery gives off the posterior superior alveolar branch as it enters the pterygopalatine fossa, runs with the corresponding branch of the maxillary nerve to supply the upper posterior teeth and the adjacent structure. The maxillary artery mnemonics, that is from the first part, we have IDAMA, idama, inferior alveolar artery, deep auricular, anterior tympanic, middle meningeal, accessory meningeal. The second one, our second part, we have that is second folate, that MPDB, masseteric, pterygoid, deep temporal, buccal. Big, fat, third part, posterior, superior alveolar artery, infraorbital artery, greater palatine artery, sphenopalatine artery, artery to pterygoid canal, and the pterygoid, the pharyngeal artery. And this is the picture showing how is the supply of the different parts of the maxillary artery. The veins pass through the pterygomaxillary fissure to join the pterygoid plexus of the veins in the infratemporal fossa. It is like a network. This is located partly between the temporalis and the pterygoid muscles. The venous equivalent of the most of the maxillary artery, actually a network of the veins, so it will just running with the branch of the maxillary artery.